In the freezing skies over Europe, survival wasn't measured in years, but in gallons of aviation fuel and the sealing of a fighter's engine. By the spring of 1942, the Royal Air Force was bleeding out. Their heavy bombers were falling from the sky like burning autumn leaves, slaughtered by German Focke-Wulfs operating in the thin, unforgiving air where British escorts simply couldn't breathe. They desperately needed a miracle. What they got instead was an unproven American prototype that looked like a thoroughbred but possessed the lungs of a dying dog, until an unauthorized stroke of genius changed the world. The wind howling across the grass airfield at RAF Duxford carried the unmistakable scent of high-octane aviation fuel and damp English earth. It was April 1942, and the mood among the men of Army Cooperation Command was caught somewhere between grim determination and quiet despair. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Hughes stood near the edge of the tarmac, the collar of his fleece-lined Irvin jacket turned up against the chill, his eyes fixed on the strange, gleaming metal beast being rolled out of the hangar. It was designated the North American Mustang Malka First. "Looks fast just sitting there, doesn't it, Artie?" murmured Squadron Leader Thomas Sterling, lighting a player's Navy-cut cigarette. The match flared brightly for a second, illuminating the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. "Looks can be terribly deceiving, sir," Arthur replied, though he couldn't take his eyes off the machine. It was, objectively, a beautiful aircraft. Unlike the beloved Spitfire with its graceful, elliptical wings, the Mustang was all sharp, aggressive angles and a remarkably squared-off stance. It had a wide-track undercarriage that promised stability on rough frontline strips, and the fuselage was incredibly sleek. The Americans, at North American Aviation, had designed it from a blank sheet of paper in a staggering 117 days to fulfill a desperate British purchasing commission order. The secret to its aesthetic, and as Arthur was about to find out, its initial curse was the radical laminar flow wing. Designed by an eccentric aerodynamicist named Edgar Schmood, the wing placed its thickest point much further aft than traditional designs, theoretically allowing the air to slide over it with minimal drag. "They say it's a pure ground attack kite," Sterling said, exhaling a thin stream of gray smoke fitted with the Allison engine. "The V-1710. Arthur grimaced. "The Allison. Right." 30 minutes later, Arthur was strapped into the cramped, cold cockpit of the Mustang. The dashboard was a chaotic jumble of American gauges that he had spent the last 2 days memorizing. He primed the engine, hit the starter, and the 12-cylinder Allison roared to life. It didn't possess the refined, angry crackle of a Rolls-Royce Merlin. It was a deeper, throatier, almost tractor-like bellow. He signaled the chocks away, taxied to the end of the grass runway, and opened the throttle. The acceleration was violent. The Mustang practically leaped off the ground, the wide undercarriage making the takeoff run remarkably stable compared to the narrow-stance Spitfire. He retracted the gear and kept the nose low, skimming just above the treetops of the Cambridgeshire countryside. At 3,000 feet, the aircraft was a revelation. Arthur pushed the throttle forward, and the airspeed indicator wound up past 350 miles per hour, then 370. He threw the stick hard to the starboard, and the Mustang snapped into a roll with a crispness that made his heart race. The laminar wing worked perfectly. Down here, in the thick air, it was undeniably the fastest fighter in the world. It outran the Spitfire Mach V with ease, leaving it entirely in the dust. The visibility from the cockpit was superb. Euphoria gripped him. "We have a winner," he thought, adrenaline surging through his veins. "We can take the fight to them." "Ground control, this is Blue Leader," Arthur radioed, his voice tight with excitement. "She handles like an absolute dream down here. Initiating climb test." "Roger. Blue Leader. Proceed to Angels 20. Arthur pulled back on the stick and pointed the aggressive nose toward the overcast sky. For the first 10,000 feet, the climb was steady and strong. The Allison engine hummed its baritone tune. But as the altimeter needle crossed 13,000 feet, the engine's note began to change. It started to sound hollow, breathless. By 15,000 feet, the throttle was wide open, but the speed was bleeding off rapidly. By 18,000 feet, the controls grew sluggish, mushy in his hands. The air was getting thin, and the Allison engine, lacking a multi-stage supercharger, simply couldn't compress enough oxygen to keep generating power. The thoroughbred had suddenly turned into an asthmatic plow horse. Arthur stared at the instruments in crushing disappointment. He was barely holding 250 miles per hour. Above him, at 25,000 feet, the German Focke-Wulf 190S and Messerschmitt 109S operated with lethal impunity. If a Luftwaffe pilot caught him up here, Arthur knew he would be a sitting duck. He wouldn't even have the power to dive away effectively before being blown out of the sky. He brought the aircraft back to Duxford, the earlier euphoria completely extinguished. When he climbed out of the cockpit, Sterling was waiting. "Well?" his commanding officer asked. Arthur pulled off his leather flying helmet, his hair matted with cold sweat. "It's a tragedy, Tom. Down on the deck, she's a demon. The aerodynamics are brilliant, but take her above 15,000 feet, and the engine completely dies of starvation. The Focke-Wulfs will slaughter us if we try to escort the heavy bombers with this." The verdict across the RAF was unanimous. The Mustang Mach I was relegated to low-level reconnaissance and ground attack. It was a useful tool for shooting up trains in occupied France, but it was entirely useless for the one thing the Allies desperately needed: a high-altitude, long-range escort fighter to protect the heavy bombers, striking deep into Germany. The bomber boys in the Lancasters and B-17S would have to continue dying alone in the freezing stratosphere. The best airframe in the world was married to the wrong engine, and bureaucracy dictated that it would stay that way. The turning point didn't happen in a boardroom at the Air Ministry, nor did it happen in Washington. It happened because a civilian test pilot had a habit of poking his nose where it supposedly didn't belong. In April of 1942, Ronald Harker, a senior liaison test pilot for Rolls-Royce, found himself invited to RAF Duxford. Harker was a man who lived and breathed engine telemetry. He had spent the war testing every variant of the Spitfire, pushing the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine to its absolute limits. He was at Duxford to demonstrate a new Spitfire, but his eyes were immediately drawn to the sleek, squared-off American fighters parked at the far end of the airfield. "What are those doing just sitting there?" Harker asked Arthur Hughes, who had been assigned to escort the Rolls-Royce man. Arthur sighed, kicking a tuft of grass. "Mustangs. Lovely airframes. Terrible lungs. We use them for taking photos of French rail yards. Take 'em high, and they just wheeze." Harker's curiosity was piqued. "Mind if I take one up?" Arthur chuckled darkly. "Be my guest. Just don't expect to break any altitude records." Harker climbed into the cockpit of a Mustang Mach I, registration AM 106. He ran through the unfamiliar checks, fired up the Allison, and took to the sky. 30 minutes later, Harker landed, taxied back, and cut the engine. He sat in the cockpit for a long moment, staring at the instrument panel in total silence. When he finally climbed down, his face was pale, his eyes wide with a frantic, calculating energy. "Mr. Harker?" Arthur asked, concerned. "Are you all right?" "Flight Lieutenant Hughes," Harker said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The Americans have inadvertently built a masterpiece, and they don't even realize it. With respect, sir, we know the airframe is good." "You don't understand," Harker interrupted, grabbing Arthur by the shoulder of his flight jacket. "I know drag coefficients. I know what a Spitfire needs to do 350 miles an hour. This American kite is doing exactly the same speeds on roughly 2/3 of the horsepower. Do you understand what that means? The aerodynamic drag is practically non-existent. The laminar wing is a miracle." Harker looked back at the Mustang, shaking his head. "The Allison engine is strangling it. But if we could somehow mate this airframe to a proper two-stage supercharged engine, if we put a Merlin 61 inches that nose." Arthur's eyes widened as the implication hit him. The Merlin 61 was the mechanical heart of the new Spitfire Mach 9. It produced massive power at high altitudes. If they put it into a low-drag airframe, like the Mustang, with its massive internal fuel capacity, it would fly to Berlin and back, Arthur breathed, and fight when it got there. Harker didn't wait around. He practically ran to the base telephone exchange and placed a direct call to the managing director of Rolls-Royce, Ernest Hives. "Mr. Hives, it's Ronnie," Harker said, the static of the wartime line crackling in his ear. "I've just flown the American Mustang. The aerodynamics are light years ahead of anything we or the Germans have, but the engine is useless at altitude." "What are you suggesting, Ronnie?" Hives' gravelly voice replied. "I am suggesting, sir, that if we put a Merlin 61 into the Mustang airframe, we will have the finest fighter aircraft the world has ever seen. It will solve the bomber escort crisis overnight." There was a long pause on the line. Hives was a man of action, but he knew the political nightmare this would entail. "The Americans won't like us tinkering with their design, Ronnie. And the Air Ministry will say it's an engineering impossibility. The Merlin is longer, heavier, and requires massive intercoolers that the Allison doesn't." "I don't care about the ministry," Harker said stubbornly. "Give me 3 airframes. Let us do it at Hucknall. We can engineer the mounts. We have to try." Hives sighed. "I'll see what strings I can pull." What followed was a brutal 5-month war of bureaucracy. The British Air Ministry was fiercely resistant. They were already struggling to produce enough Merlins for their Lancasters, Mosquitoes, and Spitfires. Diverting engines to experiment on an American airframe seemed like a colossal waste of resources. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, North American Aviation's chief designer, Ray Rice, had independently come to a similar conclusion, but he was facing his own battles with the U.S. appoint. Army Air Forces, who were deeply skeptical of British engines and fiercely protective of their own domestic designs. It took the intervention of Major Thomas Hitchcock, an influential American air attaché stationed in London. Hitchcock, a former polo champion and a man who possessed immense political leverage, heard about Harker's idea. Hitchcock had watched the American 8th Air Force bombers get torn to shreds during their unescorted daylight raids over Europe. He knew the stakes. Hitchcock bypassed the standard channels, violently bullied the British Air Ministry into releasing 5 Mustang airframes to Rolls-Royce, and personally lobbied Washington to support the experiment. In August 1942, 3 Mustang Mach I airframes arrived at the Rolls-Royce testing facility at Hucknall. They were rolled into a highly restricted, heavily guarded hangar. The unauthorized surgery was about to begin. By October 1942, the weather over the Midlands had turned perpetually gray and bitter. Inside the unheated hangars at Hucknall, the Rolls-Royce engineering team had been working 20-hour shifts, fueled by rationed tea, black market cigarettes, and a desperate, frantic energy. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Hughes, assigned as an RAF technical liaison to the project, stood on the oily concrete floor, watching the mechanics wrestle with the heavy steel engine mounts. The conversion was turning out to be a nightmare. Harker's brilliant idea was mechanically brutal to execute. The Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 was a monstrous, beautiful piece of engineering, but it was significantly larger than the Allison. It featured a complex, 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger that required a massive intercooler to cool the compressed air before it was fed into the cylinders. To make it fit, the engineers had been forced to aggressively modify the Mustang's nose. They essentially hacked off the sleek American cowling and grafted on an ungainly, deep-chinned air intake directly beneath the spinner to house the new oil cooler and intercooler. When Arthur looked at the prototype, designated AL975G, he couldn't help but wince. "She looks like a bulldog with a severe underbite," Arthur muttered to Ronnie Harker, who was zipping up his flight suit. Harker chuckled, adjusting his goggles. "She's not built for a beauty pageant, Artie. She's built to kill Focke-Wulfs at 30,000 feet. Today we find out if the math holds up." The tension on the airfield was thick enough to cut with a propeller blade. High-ranking officials from the Air Ministry had arrived, standing on the tarmac with clipboards, their faces masks of deep skepticism. They fully expected this Frankenstein's monster of British propulsion and American aerodynamics to fail catastrophically. The center of gravity had been radically shifted. The torque of the Merlin was immense. There were very real fears the airframe would tear itself apart in a high-speed dive. Harker climbed onto the wing, dropping into the cold leather seat. He strapped himself in, the familiar scent of dope, metal, and high-octane fuel filling his lungs. He ran through his pre-flight checks. "Clear!" Harker shouted. The starter motor whined. A high-pitched mechanical scream, and then the Merlin 61 caught. The sound was apocalyptic. Unlike the Allison's low growl, the Merlin erupted with a violent, concussive crackle that rattled the corrugated iron of the hangar behind them. Blue exhaust flames spat angrily from the ejector stubs. The airframe trembled, vibrating with a suppressed, violent energy that the original Mustang had never possessed. Arthur felt the sound deep in his chest. It sounds angry, he thought. It sounds like it wants to rip the chocks to pieces. Harker taxied out. He didn't waste time. He lined up on the runway, locked the tailwheel, and jammed the throttle forward. The torque of the massive four-bladed rotor propeller immediately tried to violently yaw the aircraft to the left. Harker stomped on the right rudder pedal, fighting the beast to keep it straight. The acceleration was terrifying. It didn't just take off. It tore itself free from the earth. Arthur raised his binoculars, watching the silver silhouette pitch upward at a staggering angle. Inside the cockpit, Harker was pinned back against his seat. The vertical speed indicator was climbing at a rate he had rarely seen in a Spitfire, let alone an aircraft carrying this much fuel. "Control, this is Harker," he radioed, his breathing heavy against the G-forces. "Passing Angels 10. Climb rate is astonishing. Engine temperatures nominal. Roger. Harker. Proceed to Angels 20 and conduct speed runs." Harker kept the nose up. 15,000 feet. The altitude where the Allison engine would have started choking to death. He glanced at the manifold pressure gauge. The Merlin's two-stage supercharger automatically shifted into high gear. Harker felt a distinct, powerful surge, like a massive hand pushing against his spine. The engine wasn't dying. It was breathing deeper, sucking in the freezing, thin atmosphere and violently compressing it into raw power. 20,000 feet. Harker leveled out. He pushed the throttle through the gate, into war emergency power. The needle on the airspeed indicator surged forward. 350. 380. 400. The airframe began to buffet slightly, protesting the immense aerodynamic pressures. But the laminar flow wing sliced through the high-altitude air with virtually zero resistance. "Control," Harker's voice cracked over the radio speaker on the ground. The Air Ministry officials stopped writing on their clipboards. Arthur held his breath. "Control, I am level at Angels 22. True airspeed is 433 miles per hour. A stunned silence fell over the tarmac at Hucknall. Arthur stared at the radio operator. 433 miles per hour. That was over 40 miles per hour faster than the Spitfire Mount 9. It was faster than any operational fighter the Germans possessed, and it was doing it at an altitude where bombers operated. "My God," whispered one of the skeptical Air Ministry officials, his monocle slipping from his eye. "He's broken the clock." Up in the cockpit, Harker wasn't finished. He pulled the stick back again. He climbed to 30,000 feet. The aircraft was still responsive, still viciously fast. He threw the Mustang into a mock dogfight, pulling tight turns that grayed out his vision. The heavy American fighter, powered by the British engine, danced in the stratosphere like a feather. But it wasn't perfect. As Harker rolled into a high-speed dive, pushing the aircraft near the speed of sound, a violent shudder rippled through the control column. The makeshift engine mounts flexed. For a terrifying 3 seconds, Harker thought the Merlin was going to rip completely out of the nose and take the propeller with it. He fought the controls, gritting his teeth, his arms screaming with the effort of pulling the heavy aircraft out of the dive. The airframe held. 20 minutes later, the prototype touched down, the brakes squealing as Harker brought the smoking, ticking machine to a halt on the apron. The silence, as the engine cut out, was deafening. Arthur was the first one to reach the aircraft, sprinting across the tarmac. He climbed up onto the wing root, just as Harker pushed the canopy back. Harker pulled his oxygen mask off. His face was soaked in sweat, leaving pale tracks through the grease on his cheeks. He looked completely exhausted, yet his eyes were blazing with a manic, triumphant fire. "Well?" Arthur demanded, his heart hammering against his ribs. Harker looked down at the Air Ministry men, who were now rushing toward the plane. He looked back at Arthur and grinned, a feral, unyielding smile. "Artie," Harker said, his voice trembling slightly from the residual adrenaline. "Tell the bomber boys to pack their bags. We're going to Berlin." The impossible had just been proven. The men on the ground stared at the ugly, hacked-together prototype in absolute disbelief. They had just witnessed a mechanical marriage of convenience transform a mediocre, low-level strafer into an absolute apex predator. The P-51 Mustang had just been born, and the air war over Europe would never, ever be the same. The triumph at Hucknall was a brilliant spark in the dark, but a spark is easily extinguished by the crushing weight of military bureaucracy. Proving that a British Rolls-Royce Merlin could turn the American Mustang into a world-beater was merely an engineering victory. The real war, the bitter cutthroat battle to get the aircraft mass-produced and into the hands of dying Allied pilots, was just beginning. In November 1942, the flight data from Ronald Harker's terrifying, record-breaking test flights landed on the mahogany desk of Major Tommy Hitchcock at the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square, London. Hitchcock was not a career military man. He was a wealthy, fiercely competitive 10-goal polo champion who had volunteered for the U.S. Army Air Forces at the age of 41. He possessed an aristocrat's disdain for red tape and a fighter's instinct for the jugular. When he read the numbers, 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet, he didn't just see an aircraft. He saw the salvation of the American daylight bombing campaign. He immediately requested a meeting with the top brass of the 8th Air Force, including General Carl Toohey Spaatz. "The British have cracked it, General," Hitchcock declared, throwing the heavily classified Hucknall dossier onto the table. "They took that North American strafer, ripped out the Allison, and bolted a Merlin 61 to the firewall. It outperforms the Spitfire. It outperforms the P-38 Lightning. And most importantly, with external drop tanks, it can escort our heavy bombers all the way to Germany and back." Spaatz, a cigar clamped firmly in his jaw, flipped through the pages. His expression was utterly unreadable. Across the table, a high-ranking materiel officer from Washington leaned forward, his face flushed with the indignant, stubborn pride that so often poisoned Allied cooperation. "Major Hitchcock," the officer drawled, dripping with condescension, "the P-51 was built for the British Purchasing Commission. It's a bastard child. The United States Army Air Forces is fully committed to the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the Lockheed P-38. We aren't going to upend our entire production line for a hybrid airplane powered by a foreign engine. The not invented here rule applies." Hitchcock's eyes narrowed. He leaned across the table, invading the officer's personal space. "With all due respect, Colonel, the P-47 burns through aviation fuel like a sailor on shore leave. It has to turn around at the German border. The P-38's cockpit is so cold, it's giving our pilots severe frostbite, and its engines are failing in the European damp. Our bomber boys are flying into the meat grinder unescorted." Hitchcock pointed a rigid finger at the dossier. "This is not a foreign engine anymore. The Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit has already secured the license to build the Merlin. They're calling it the V1650. We have the engine, we have the airframe. If you kill this project because of bruised domestic pride, the blood of every B-17 crewman who dies over the Ruhr Valley is on your hands." The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. It was a career-ending breach of protocol. But Hitchcock didn't care about his military career. He cared about winning the war. Spaatz slowly removed the cigar from his mouth. He looked at Hitchcock, then down at the numbers. He knew Hitchcock was right. The American heavy bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators, were taking unsustainable losses. The doctrine that heavily armed bombers could defend themselves without fighter escort was rapidly proving to be a catastrophic bloody fallacy. "Send the data to Dutch Kindleberger at North American Aviation," Spaatz finally growled, referring to the legendary president of the manufacturing company in California. "Tell him the 8th Air Force wants a prototype." Yesterday, 3,000 miles away in Inglewood, California, James Dutch Kindleberger and his brilliant chief engineer, Edgar Schmood, didn't need to be told twice. They had already been quietly crunching the numbers on a Merlin-powered Mustang. When the official green light arrived, The NAA factory floor exploded into a frenzy of controlled chaos. The British prototype at Hucknall had been a crude, hacked-together proof of concept. Schmood's team had to refine it for mass production. They beefed up the fuselage to handle the violent torque of the Packard Merlin engine. They redesigned the massive ventral radiator scoop under the belly, turning a potential aerodynamic drag nightmare into a system that actually provided a slight forward thrust, the Meredith effect, as the heated air expanded out the back. They designated the new, terrifyingly sleek machine the P-51B. But there was a twist waiting for them, a fatal flaw that nearly grounded the entire fleet before it ever saw combat. To achieve the massive range required to fly from England to Berlin, the engineers didn't just add underwing drop tanks. They installed a massive 5-gallon fuel tank directly behind the pilot's seat. It seemed like a stroke of genius, doubling the internal fuel capacity. In late summer of 1943, an American test pilot took a fully loaded P-51B up for a violent maneuverability trial over the California desert. The moment he pulled back on the stick to initiate a tight turn, the aircraft violently snapped out of control. The massive sloshing weight of the fuel behind the center of gravity acted like a pendulum of death. The aircraft tumbled into a flat spin. The pilot barely managed to bail out before the beautiful machine slammed into the Mojave sand, exploding in a brilliant ball of fire. Panic swept through the Air Materiel Command. Cries to cancel the P-51B program echoed through the halls of the Pentagon. "It's a widowmaker," the critics screamed. "It's inherently unstable." It was Schmood who stood his ground against the firing squad of generals. "The aircraft is sound," he insisted, his German accent thickening with stress. "The pilots just need a new doctrine. You cannot dogfight on a full rear tank. You fly straight and level on the rear tank first, burn it down to 25 gallons, and then you drop the wing tanks and engage the enemy. It requires discipline, but it will fly to Berlin." The generals were highly skeptical, but they had no other choice. The clock had run out. By October 1943, the skies over Europe had turned into a slaughterhouse. The crisis that Tommy Hitchcock had violently predicted had come to pass. It was culminating in what the 8th Air Force would come to call Black Thursday. On October 14th, 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from airfields across the damp, fog-choked English countryside. Their target, the vital ball, bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Hughes stood on the control tower balcony at RAF Duxford, listening to the crackling radio intercepts. The American P-47 Thunderbolts had escorted the bombers as far as they could, but as they reached the German border at Aachen, their fuel needles hit the red line. The fighters had to turn back. The moment the American escorts peeled away, the Luftwaffe fell upon the bombers like wolves upon a tethered flock. Over 300 German fighters, twin-engine Messerschmitt 110S firing rockets, heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190S attacking head-on, tore into the bomber stream. The radio channels were filled with the screams of dying men, the frantic calls for help that no one could answer, and the cold, terrifying silence of aircraft dropping out of the sky. 60 B-17S were utterly destroyed. Over 600 highly trained American crewmen were killed or captured in a single afternoon. Another 17 bombers were damaged beyond repair. The 8th Air Force was effectively broken. General Spaatz ordered an immediate halt to deep penetration daylight raids. The heavy bombers were grounded. The Germans had won the air war over their homeland. The invasion of Europe, the highly anticipated Operation Overlord, was now in severe jeopardy because the Allies could not establish air superiority. A thick, suffocating despair settled over the bomber bases in England. Men drank heavily in the pubs, staring hollow-eyed at empty chairs. The war seemed unwinnable. And then, in November 1943, amidst the sleet and the freezing mud, the wooden shipping crates began to arrive at the docks in Liverpool. The first operational P-51Bs had finally crossed the Atlantic. They were assigned to the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustangs, a unit nominally belonging to the tactical 9th Air Force but immediately hijacked by the desperate 8th for bomber escort duties. The British pilots, including Arthur Hughes, were sent to RAF Boxted to help transition the young green American pilots onto the new machines. Arthur watched as a tall, broad-shouldered American colonel named Don Blakesley strode out onto the tarmac. Blakesley was a legend, a hard-drinking, aggressively fearless combat veteran who had flown Spitfires and Thunderbolts. Blakesley walked up to a gleaming olive-drab P-51B. The massive four-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller looked like a lethal scythe. The ugly, deep-chinned air scoop underneath gave the aircraft a menacing, predatory stance. "So this is the bastard child with the British heart," Blakesley muttered, patting the cold aluminum of the fuselage. "She's a handful with a full rear tank, Colonel," Arthur warned, stepping up beside him. "The center of gravity is treacherous. You have to treat her like a bomber until you burn off the fuel behind the seat. Only then does she become a fighter." Blakesley grinned, a wolfish, reckless expression. "Son, if this thing can take me to the target and give me 5 minutes of combat time over Germany, I don't care if she handles like a pregnant cow on the way there." The training schedule was brutally short. The bomber crews were begging for salvation. When a young lieutenant complained that they hadn't had enough time to learn the intricacies of the new aircraft, Blakesley snapped back with a line that would become legendary. "You can learn to fly 'em on the way to the target." On the 11th of December 1943, the true test arrived. The target was Emden. The bomber stream assembled over the English Channel, a massive, thrumming armada of aluminum and steel, heading into the hostile freezing blue. Inside his cockpit, Major James Howard of the 354th adjusted his oxygen mask. The temperature outside his canopy was 40 degrees below zero. Behind him, the treacherous 8.5-gallon fuselage tank sloshed heavily, making the Mustang feel sluggish and ill-tempered, just as Schmood had warned. They crossed the coast of occupied Europe. The P-47s and Spitfires were with them, darting around the flanks of the bomber stream. At 11 a.m., the familiar, dreadful moment arrived. The P-47s hit their fuel limits. The radio crackled. "Big friends, this is escort leader. We are bingo fuel. Turning for home. Good luck." The snub-nosed Thunderbolts peeled away in wide arcs, heading back to the channel. In the waist gunner positions of the B-17s, young men gripped the icy steel of their 50 caliber machine guns, their stomachs tightening into hard knots of terror. This was the exact moment the Luftwaffe always struck. This was the edge of the abyss. German radar operators on the ground tracked the departure of the American fighters. In the underground bunkers of the Luftwaffe Fighter Command, General Adolf Galland, the brilliant German ace, gave the order. "The escorts have departed. Launch the interceptors. Destroy the heavy bombers." High above the clouds, a massive swarm of Messerschmitt 109s began their dive, sweeping out of the sun, hungry for the kill. The German pilots expected to see the slow, lumbering B-17s sitting completely defenseless. But as the Messerschmitts closed in, the German flight leaders blinked in utter confusion. Something was wrong. Hanging high above the bomber stream, silhouetted against the blinding glare of the sun, were sleek, aggressive shapes with squared-off wings. They were over 400 miles from the English coast. No Allied single-engine fighter in the world possessed that kind of range. It was an aerodynamic impossibility. "Achtung!" a German pilot screamed over the radio, his voice cracking with sudden, sheer panic. "Fighters! Single-engine fighters above the bombers!" In his P-51B, Major James Howard glanced down at his fuel gauges. The rear tank was nearly empty. The center of gravity had shifted back to normal. The sluggish, pregnant cow was gone. "Drop tanks," Howard barked into his throat mic. Beneath the wings of the Mustangs, the heavy external drop tanks tumbled away, splashing raw aviation fuel into the freezing slipstream. Freed of the dead weight, the P-51Bs surged forward. Howard shoved the throttle to the firewall. The American-built, British-designed heart of the beast, the supercharged Packard Merlin engine, roared with a deafening mechanical fury. The Mustangs tore out of the sun and smashed headlong into the German formation. The disbelief among the Luftwaffe pilots was total. They had been completely blindsided by a technological ghost. A Messerschmitt 109 tried to pull into a climbing turn to escape, confident that the American fighter would stall in the thin air at 28,000 feet. Instead, the P-51B, riding on Edgar Schmood's brilliant laminar flow wing, stayed glued to the Messerschmitt's tail. Howard squeezed the trigger on his control stick. 4 50-caliber Browning machine guns erupted in the wings, sending a lethal stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, tearing through the Messerschmitt's fuselage. The German fighter exploded in a blinding flash of orange fire and black smoke. Down in the B-17S, the American bomber crews pressed their faces against the freezing plexiglass windows. They had braced themselves for death. Instead, they were watching a massacre in reverse. They watched as the strange, beautiful new fighters completely dismantled the German attack, flying circles around the legendary Luftwaffe. A waist gunner in a crippled fortress named Memphis Belle keyed his intercom, his voice shaking with a mixture of shock, adrenaline, and overwhelming relief. "Skipper, you seeing this? Who the hell are those guys?" The pilot's voice came back, thick with emotion. "I don't know who they are, son, but I think we're going to live to see tomorrow." The bastard child had arrived. The skies over Germany had just been violently, irrevocably claimed. By January 1944, the shockwaves of the Mustang's arrival were ripping through the highest echelons of the Third Reich. But in the freezing, mud-soaked airfields of England, the American pilots knew that the P-51B, for all its magnificent speed and range, still harbored a lethal blind spot. The original fuselage design featured a razorback spine behind the cockpit, blending into a heavily framed greenhouse-style canopy. In the terrifying, three-dimensional chaos of a dogfight, visibility was life. A pilot who couldn't check his 6 o'clock was a dead man flying. The British had attempted a stopgap fix by fitting a bulbous Perspex Malcolm hood over the cockpit, but the engineers at North American Aviation were already working on a permanent, radical solution. They completely cut away the rear fuselage spine and grafted on a massive, uninterrupted teardrop of molded plexiglass. They also increased the armament from 4 heavy machine guns to 6, fixing the agonizing gun jamming issues that had plagued the earlier models. This was the P-51D. It was the absolute perfected apex predator of the skies. Its arrival coincided with a massive, ruthless shift in American air doctrine. In January, Major General Jimmy Doolittle, the fiercely aggressive mastermind behind the 1942 Tokyo raid, took command of the 8th Air Force. On his first day, Doolittle walked into the Fighter Command headquarters and saw a large, prominently displayed placard on the wall. It read, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Doolittle stared at the sign for a long moment. Then, to the absolute shock of the commanding officers in the room, he tore it down. "This is fundamentally wrong," Doolittle stated, his voice hard and uncompromising. "If we stay tied to the bombers, the Luftwaffe dictates the terms of the battle. They decide when and where to strike. We are no longer going to be their flying shields. From this day forward, the first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to pursue and destroy the enemy." The order was a seismic shock to the system. For months, fighter pilots had been strictly court-martialed for breaking formation to chase fleeing German planes. Now, they were being ordered to take the fight to the deck. They were taken off the leash. Among the young men unleashed by Doolittle's decree were the pilots of the 357th Fighter Group, the Oxford Boys. Based at RAF Leiston, the group boasted aggressive, naturally gifted flyers like 22-year-old Captain Clarence Bud Anderson and a fiercely competitive 21-year-old flight officer from West Virginia named Charles Chuck Yeager. "They told us we were going hunting," Anderson later recounted to the ground crews, his eyes scanning the sleek silver lines of his newly assigned P-51D, which he had christened Old Crow. "We weren't just going to escort the heavies. We were going to drop down and shoot up their airfields, their trains, their infrastructure. We were going to bleed them dry." The psychological impact on the German pilots was devastating. Previously, a Luftwaffe pilot could dive away from a bomber formation, knowing the American escorts would not follow them down. They could land, refuel, and attack again. Now, When a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf pilot tried to disengage and dive for the safety of his home airfield, he would look back to see the terrifying, squared-off silhouette of a Mustang screaming down right behind him. The P-51 could outdive almost anything in the sky, its heavy weight and low-drag laminar wing turning it into a ballistic missile. In the cavernous halls of the Air Ministry in Berlin, the head of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, flatly refused to believe the frantic reports coming from his sector commanders. "It is aerodynamically impossible," Göring bellowed, pounding his fist on the heavy oak table. "The Americans do not possess a single-engine fighter capable of escorting bombers to the capital and dogfighting when they get here. It is propaganda." But the harsh metallic reality of the war was about to shatter Göring's delusions. The ultimate test was looming on the horizon. The Allies were finally preparing to strike the black heart of the Reich in broad daylight. They were going to Berlin. The 6th of March, 1944. The morning air over the English countryside was dense with a freezing, biting fog, but above the cloud deck, the sun illuminated a terrifyingly magnificent spectacle. The 8th Air Force was launching a maximum effort. Operation Argument had paved the way, and now, the absolute full weight of American industrial vengeance was being hurled directly at the heart of the Third Reich. Over 800 heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators clawed their way into the thin, unforgiving air, assembling into massive, sprawling combat boxes that stretched for nearly 100 miles across the sky. The combined roar of over 3,000 Wright Cyclone and Pratt & Whitney radial engines created a continuous, bone-rattling thunder that could be felt deep in the chest of every civilian standing on the ground below. Their target was Berlin, the capital, the black heart of the enemy. High above the lumbering bomber stream, flying at a staggering 28,000 feet, was the fighter escort. Among them was the legendary 4th Fighter Group, led by the fiercely aggressive Colonel Don Blakesley. Nestled in the formation was Flight Lieutenant Arthur Hughes, flying a silver P-51 Mustang as an RAF exchange officer. The cockpit of the Mustang was a brutal, hostile environment. At this altitude, the outside temperature had plummeted to 60 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The canopy was etched with intricate patterns of white frost. Arthur's breath came in ragged, measured gasps through his rubber oxygen mask, each exhalation crystallizing almost instantly. The heater in his flight suit was struggling against the sheer, penetrating cold of the stratosphere. The only warmth came from the massive Packard Merlin V1000, 650 engine sitting just inches in front of his boots, humming with a rhythmic, immensely powerful vibration that he could feel in his teeth. It was a grueling test of human endurance. Escorting bombers deep into Germany meant sitting in that cramped, freezing seat for up to 6 hours. Pilots suffered from excruciating leg cramps, hypoxia, and the constant gnawing terror that the engine might swallow a valve over hostile territory. But today, the exhaustion was entirely eclipsed by a heavy, suffocating blanket of adrenaline. They were crossing the Elbe River. They were in the absolute deepest reaches of enemy airspace, a place where Allied fighters had never been able to tread. In the underground concrete bunkers of the Luftwaffe Fighter Command, General of the fighters Adolf Galland stared at the massive plotting tables with a mixture of awe and rising panic. The radar operators were pushing hundreds of markers across the map, tracking the American armada. Galland ordered his commanders to spring the ultimate trap. He launched the Sturmböcke heavily armed Focke-Wulf 196 alongside twin-engine Messerschmitt 110 Zerstörers carrying underwing rockets. The German doctrine was simple and historically effective. Wait until the American fighters reached the absolute limit of their fuel range and were forced to turn back. Then, fall upon the unescorted bombers and butcher them over the capital. As the bomber stream approached the sprawling, flak-defended outskirts of Berlin, the Luftwaffe struck. Over 400 German fighters plunged out of the blinding glare of the high-altitude sun. They came in massive waves, a swarm of gray and mottled green predators hungry for the kill. The German pilots were highly experienced, fanatically dedicated, and completely confident that the skies over Berlin belonged to them. Bandits Bandits, 12 o'clock high and dropping fast. Looks like the whole damn Luftwaffe is up today, the radio crackled in Arthur's headset. The voice belonged to Blakesley, calm but laced with a lethal anticipation. Arthur's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He looked up through the perspex canopy. The sky above the bombers was suddenly filled with the condensation trails of plunging German fighters. This was the moment of truth. This was the twist the Germans had never accounted for. "All right, boys," Blakesley's voice barked over the designated fighter frequency. "Drop tanks. Let's go to work." Across the freezing blue expanse, hundreds of silver, teardrop-shaped external fuel tanks tumbled away from the bellies and wings of the P-51 Mustangs. The raw aviation fuel splashed into the slipstream, vaporizing instantly. The physical transformation of the aircraft was instantaneous and violent. Freed from the massive aerodynamic drag and heavy dead weight of the drop tanks, the Mustangs surged forward like chained hounds, suddenly slipped from their leashes. Arthur shoved the throttle completely through the gate, engaging war emergency power. The two-stage supercharger of the Merlin engine screamed, violently compressing the thin atmospheric air, and the Mustang leaped forward, pinning him hard against his armor-plated seat. The German pilots in the vanguard of the attack were already lining up their gun sights on the B-17S, fully expecting the distant fighter escorts to be low on fuel and turning for England. Instead, they looked out of their canopies and saw a nightmare. Sleek, silver, single-engine fighters with radically squared-off wings were tearing through the bomber formations at over 400 miles per hour, closing the distance with terrifying, impossible speed. The shock among the Luftwaffe ranks was total. A panicked transmission, intercepted by British intelligence later, revealed the sheer disbelief. "Achtung! Armeejäger über der Hauptstadt!" American fighters over the capital. It was an aerodynamic impossibility that had suddenly become a lethal reality. Arthur picked out a heavy twin-engine Messerschmitt 110 that was banking aggressively to fire its rockets into a squadron of B-17S. He snapped his control stick hard to the right. The laminar flow wing, a design the British had once dismissed as a failure at altitude, sliced through the stratosphere with zero resistance. The P-51 rolled with crisp, violent precision. Arthur pulled the nose through the turn, graying out for a second as the G-forces crushed the blood out of his head. The German pilot saw him coming and threw the heavy fighter into a desperate dive. But the Mustang was built for the dive. Arthur stayed glued to the Messerschmitt's tail, the heavy American airframe gaining speed like a falling anvil. He lined up the glowing orange pipper of his K-14 gyroscopic gun sight directly on the right engine of the retreating German. He squeezed the trigger on the stick. The 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the wings roared to life, vibrating the entire airframe with concussive force. A solid, blinding stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds reached out across the void, walking up the fuselage of the Messerschmitt and tearing directly into the starboard engine nacelle. The German fighter shuddered violently as the heavy rounds ripped through metal and fuel lines. A second later, the engine exploded in a brilliant, blinding flash of orange fire and thick black smoke. The Messerschmitt snapped into a violent, uncontrollable death spiral, plummeting toward the earth miles below. Everywhere Arthur looked, the sky was a chaotic, three-dimensional slaughterhouse. The legendary Luftwaffe was being systematically dismantled over its own capital. Captain Bud Anderson, of the 357th Fighter Group, flying his P-51 Old Crow, was tearing through a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s, outturning the heavily armored German fighters, with an ease that bordered on the absurd. The Mustangs were fighting in the vertical, utilizing the massive torque and high-altitude breathing capability of the British Merlin engine to climb above the Germans, then plunging back down in lethal, slashing boom and zoom attacks. The German command structure collapsed into chaos. Their fighters were burning fuel at an unsustainable rate, forced into defensive dogfights, while the heavy bombers proceeded completely unmolested to their targets. The bombs fell on the industrial sectors of Berlin in a devastating, unbroken rain of high explosives. For 30 minutes, the sky over Berlin was a swirling vortex of tracer fire, screaming engines, and exploding aluminum. By the time Blakesley finally called for the fighters to reform and begin the long, grueling journey back to the English Channel, the damage had been done. The air was littered with the drifting white parachutes of bailed-out airmen, and the twisting, flaming wreckage of dozens of destroyed aircraft. Arthur eased his throttle back, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the stick. His flight suit was drenched in a freezing sweat. He was entirely exhausted, running on the absolute fumes of adrenaline. But as he looked out his canopy at the surviving B-17s, turning their noses westward toward home, flanked by a protective wall of silver Mustangs, a profound, overwhelming sense of awe washed over him. The desperate gamble at Hucknall had worked. The impossible machine had been forged. Days later, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring would stand in the rubble of a bombed-out Berlin street, looking up at the gray, smoke-filled sky. When asked by an aide what the appearance of the American escort fighters meant for the defense of the Reich, the head of the Luftwaffe didn't shout. He didn't boast. He gave a quiet, utterly defeated answer that would echo through history. "When I saw those Mustangs over Berlin," Göring confessed, the crushing weight of the inevitable settling onto his shoulders, "I knew the jig was up. I knew that the war was lost." The Allied pilots had not just broken the Luftwaffe's planes, they had broken their spirit. The P-51 Mustang had seized the European sky, turning a desperate, bleeding war of attrition into the dawn of absolute victory. The North American P-51 Mustang stands as one of the most profound engineering miracles in the history of military aviation. Born from desperate British specifications and rapidly designed by American engineers, it was initially crippled by a fatal lack of high-altitude performance. It took the unauthorized, visionary brilliance of a Rolls-Royce test pilot to realize that marrying the sleek, low-drag American airframe to the monstrous power of a British Merlin engine would create an unparalleled weapon of war. This hybrid masterpiece fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of World War II. By providing the crucial long-range escort that the heavy bomber formations desperately needed, the Mustang decimated the Luftwaffe over their own territory. It transformed a terrifying war of attrition into a decisive Allied victory in the air, saving thousands of crewmen's lives and directly enabling the liberation of Europe. It was the ultimate apex predator of its era,